All right, so let's pray and get started then. Abba, thank you for this opportunity that we have again to sit around your word with one another and be taught by you. Help us to continue to persevere. Okay, I'm gonna stop here so that I can mute everybody. Sorry about that. Then I need to figure it out how to do it. Okay.
I think we're all muted now, Joey. I'm muted.
Yes, but I need to do it from here so that it applies even to whoever comes on board. Okay, now I got it. Okay, let's finish that prayer then. And so we gather around your word and with one another, Father, to learn from you. Teach us your word. Speak to our need, to the areas in our heart that need to hear you, your correction or your encouragement. And certainly a word of knowledge and a word of wisdom to know how to love you better, love one another better, and just be encouraged and strengthened in you to continue to do what we do in living for you and in serving you. We thank you in Yeshua's name. Amen. Okay, so let me get this going again. All right, so we are in the book of Deuteronomy. So the first thing we're going to say about Deuteronomy is that it is a continuation from the book of Numbers, but a little different than what we had seen before. So Deuteronomy has an independent beginning. So far, we've seen that Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers had a beginning that depended on the previous book. So it was a continuation, a narrative continuation, but Deuteronomy is not. Deuteronomy has an independent beginning. It does not start with what we call a preterite verb, which is a simple past, the verb that is used for narratives. So this is not starting as a continuation from the narrative from Numbers. In terms of the narrative itself, it does have other forms of continuation, which we're going to highlight today. So it does not begin with the typical vav word, which is the Hebrew way of saying and, and the Lord spoke to him, and these are the names. That's how the other books begin. So in other words, Deuteronomy does not have a narratival continuation with the book of Numbers, although it does have thematic continuation with everything that came before, Genesis through Numbers. So the opening phrase of the book indicates a different delivery method. Here's what I mean. Rather than being primarily a narrative, Deuteronomy is primarily speeches. And we get that from the first from the first few words where it says, these are the words. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel. We can translate that as these are the speeches. And the reason is that Deuteronomy has 7 different speeches, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But let's talk about the name of the book first. So the name of the book, the English name, which comes from the Latin, which comes from the Greek, but it's not a church name. when the Jewish people translated the Tanakh into Greek, they were the ones who chose the name for this book. That was done 200, 250 years before Yeshua. So there weren't any Christians around. So this is not a Christian thing. So the title Deuteronomy comes from two Greek words. Deutero is related to the word dos or dual in English, right? Two or second. And the word namas means Torah or law, but it's Torah. So literally it says the second law, the second law. And we see this in Deuteronomy 17:18. So Deuteronomy 17:18 says, now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom. Who is he? Well, this is the king that Israel will eventually have. So the Lord didn't forbid Israel from wanting a king. He just didn't want him to want a king like the other nations. And that's when they run into problems. So the Lord gives instruction. He says, when you have a king and he sits on his throne, he shall write for himself a copy of this law, a copy of this Torah. So this phrase here, a copy of this Torah, literally in Hebrew is Mishneh Torah. Sounds like the Mishnah, right? Why? Because the Mishnah means repetition. So that's how you memorize the oral tradition, by repeating it. You repeat it to yourself. You repeat it to yourself. So what the Lord is saying here, the king needs to repeat the Torah to himself, but not in a meditative way, but actually write it, right? Because it uses the verb, he shall write. So he shall write the Torah again for himself. So that phrase then in Hebrew, it is translated into the Septuagint. It is translated with the word Deuteronomian. Deuteronomy, we get the word from there. So that's where the name comes from the Greek translation of Deuteronomy 17:18. And so, but of course, we know that the Hebrew name is Devarim, which is the word that means words. These are the words. And from there, we translated these are the speeches, because we're going to see the 7 speeches that Moses gives. So the book is commonly understood as a repetition of the law, but is it really a repetition of the law? For instance, how much of Genesis is repeated here? Not a lot. We don't have the account of creation. We don't have Adam and Eve. We don't have Noah and the flood. We don't have the Tower of Babel. We don't have the patriarchs at all. So we have some references to the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we don't have any of the narrative. How much of Exodus is in Deuteronomy? Well, we have Sinai in chapter 5. We have the 10 Commandments. We have references to the Exodus, of course, and to the golden calf, but that's about it. How much is it repeated from Leviticus? Well, we have none of the narratives from Leviticus, like the narrative of the ordination of the priests and Nadab and Abihu when they brought a strange fire. We don't have any of that. We have some commandments that are repeated and kind of changed a little bit. And we don't have any of the specific explanation of the sacrifices repeat. How about Numbers? How much of Numbers is found in Deuteronomy? Well, this is the most content for this is the book from which Deuteronomy borrows the most or repeats the most. So we have the appointment of the judges in Deuteronomy. We have the story of the spies in Numbers 13 and 14. We have the refusal of Israel to enter the land. And then we have the stories of the kings, Sihon and Og, at the end of Deuteronomy. So it takes a lot more, but it is confined to a couple of chapters at the beginning. And then after that, there's no more repetition of Deuteronomy. So, I'm sorry, of the other books of the Torah in Deuteronomy. So It's easy to say that Deuteronomy is not an interpretation of the Torah, but what is it then? Well, the key is in the Hebrew title, Devarim, which means words or speeches, right? These are the speeches. And in the speeches, we have a summary of the Torah. So that's what we have. So rather than a full repetition, what we have is a summary. And Moses is summarizing, he's taking some specific stories from the Torah, primarily from Numbers, right? To suit the purpose that he has in Deuteronomy. And we'll see that a little bit. He takes only what is necessary for the rhetorical purpose that he has in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy then has thematic continuation. It does not have narrative continuation, but it has thematic continuation. So the themes that we see from Genesis to Numbers are continued in Deuteronomy. So for instance, although not a single story from Genesis is repeated in Deuteronomy, the covenant promise of the land to the patriarchs is foundational in the book of Deuteronomy, of course. Deuteronomy is all about entering the land. And this comes from the covenants that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even before that, all of Genesis, from Genesis 1, is all about the land. Adam and Eve, they are given the land recently created. And then they're expelled from the land. Same thing with Cain, is expelled further from the land. But Seth gets to stay in the land. Then everybody from the flood story, from the time of Noah, they are in a way expelled from the land because they perish. They perish from the land. And then we see chapter 10, in which the seed that is cursed, which is Canaan, the grandson of Noah, or the son of Ham, he gets to stay in the land, and the land actually takes his name. So this is the land of Canaan. So we see strong connections to Genesis 10, chapter 2 to 4, and chapter 1, because in chapter 1 is where we see the beginning of this theme of the seed. Then Exodus is, of course, part of the foundation of Deuteronomy, because the book is a continuation of Israel's journey. So Deuteronomy is a continuation of Israel's journey from Egypt all to Sinai, all the way to the land of Canaan. So this trajectory would be incomplete without the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy has the same theme of Israel traversing from Egypt to Sinai and then on to Canaan. Also, the redemption from Egypt and the tabernacle constituted Israel into a nation, and God made God and made God Israel's God, dwelling in their midst. If you recall, that's the theme of Exodus. Also, we have the giving of the covenant in Exodus 20. Some people call it the giving of the Torah, the giving of the law, but it really is the giving of the covenant with its law code in Exodus 21 to 23. And that is repeated in a way in Deuteronomy. It's expanded, actually. So Exodus has the Mishpatim and the Chukim. If you recall, the Mishpatim are the civil commandments, and the Chukim are the worship commandments. Well, the Mishpatim in Exodus are in 21 to 23, and the Chukim, because they're worship commandments, it's actually all the commandments related to the tabernacle, right? So we have the beginning of the Chukim and the Mishpatim, which are going to be expanded greatly in Deuteronomy. Same thing with Leviticus. So the Leviticus sacrificial instructions are assumed in Deuteronomy. They're assumed that the people know, the reader knows. And there are some specific details from the sacrificial instructions that are recontextualized in Exodus. What do I mean by that? Well, in Leviticus, these commandments about the sacrificial system, they assume a nomadic wilderness life, right? Israel is in the wilderness, the tabernacle is in the wilderness. So Leviticus assumes that. So for instance, Leviticus will say, if you want to eat meat, you have to bring it into the tabernacle. So this isn't a sacrifice. This is just, you just want to make some good burgers, have a barbecue, whatever. It says, no, you have to bring it into the tabernacle because you are pretty close to the tabernacle, right? Everybody's camped around the tabernacle. So you need to bring it and kill it as a sacrifice. But in Deuteronomy, you may be living way up north in the Galilee or way down south in the Negev. You're not going to go to Jerusalem so that you can cook steaks for dinner, right? So in Deuteronomy, it is permitted for you to kill the animal that is not a sacrifice. As long as you pour out the blood, then it's okay to kill it in the place where you live. So some people get tripped up. Some people actually that they are looking for flaws, so to speak, in the Word of God. They are liberal theologians, and they say, they point to things like these, and they say, you see, this is number one. It wasn't written by Moses. It has contradictions in it, so things like that, and they just don't want to hear the arguments because enough conservative scholars have pointed out that this is not a contradiction. This is just a recontextualization. But the liberals, they want to keep repeating themselves. They're not intellectually honest to see the explanation and say, you know what, yeah, that's really what's happening. So whether they are theologically liberal or politically liberal, so we can talk a lot about that, they do the same thing, right? They want to believe what they want to believe, and they want to distort reality, and they don't want to have constructive interactions. They just don't want to change. They want to keep believing what they do because they have an agenda, and so do we. Um, so the key stories from the book of Numbers are the starting point of Deuteronomy. So that's further thematic continuation, right? So in particular, this talks about the failure to enter the land and possess it. Dispossess the Canaanites and take possession of the land of Canaan. So we see the thematic continuation there, as well as the early successes of the second generation in conquering the land by defeating Sihon and Og on the other side of the Jordan, right? So that's your thematic continuation. But more importantly is the plot continuation between Deuteronomy and what came before Genesis to Numbers. So this actually reveals the nature of the macro plot of the Torah, because now we're in the last book of the Torah. So now we can see the plot structure of the entire Torah as a book. We see that the crisis that arose in the book of Numbers, right, when Israel refused the climactic confrontation of expelling the Canaanites from the land, when Israel refused this, it brought on this incredible crisis. We what we see is the conflict that is rising and rising and getting more tense and more tense. And then you were supposed to go into the confrontation, which is the climax, but Israel refused when they were afraid of the giants and didn't believe that the Lord was going to fight for them, so they didn't obey God. So this brought on this crisis in the plot of the Torah. But the Torah is going to pick that up and take it as an escalation of the conflict. So we cannot move onto the confrontation, the climax, which brings about the resolution. So we go back to create even more tension in the conflict. So that's what we see. That's where Deuteronomy fits. So this confrontation will happen, but not in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, we do not see Israel entering to possess the land just yet. Deuteronomy is a preparation of the second generation to go in and enter the land. But they will enter the land and have the confrontation, the climax with the Canaanites in the book of Joshua, not in the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy concludes the Torah without a resolution, without even a confrontation. We're still in the conflict. So the whole of Deuteronomy represents a restatement of the conflict, an escalation of the conflict, the crisis of the conflict of the whole Torah. Let me show you a graphic depiction of the macro plot of the Torah then. So we have the context, conflict, climax, consequence, and conclusion, right? By now, you who hear me at Sukkot, you know this is what I do, right? This helps us understand so much of the narrative. Um, so every story has these 5 points, this structure, whether it is, a little story for children, whether it is a movie, a novel that you read. Every good story, well-written story has these points. It's going to have an introduction and a conclusion, right? So I call the introduction the context. This is the context of the story, right? That gives you the time, the setting, the people involved. So you have an introduction and a conclusion, right? But every story is going to have a conflict. So you have after the introduction or context, you have the conflict, and the conflict is going to be continue to grow and grow in tension and more intense until you come to the point where you have to have a climax. You have to have a confrontation. And the confrontation leads to a resolution. Then after the resolution, you're going straight to the conclusion. You go into an explanation of what the story is all about, right? So I always say that after the prince changes and he's not a beast anymore, right? Beauty and the Beast. When he's not a beast anymore, then we get the moral of the story, right? What's the moral of the story? Well, that you should not focus on the outward appearance of a person, right? That you should focus on the beauty, the inner beauty of a person. That's the consequence of that story. That's the message of that story. And so every biblical story is going to have a theology of it. This is the theological teaching, what God is teaching through this story, whether it is an individual story or a macro story. So this is the place in which we learn what the theology of it is. And that's true of the entire Torah. So, so what we have here then in the Torah is that the context of it is actually Genesis 1. This is where we see the important message of Genesis 1 is that God created this seed fruitfulness system, right? That's based on this seed that God creates. And then in chapter 3, we see the conflict between the seeds. And in Hebrews, it uses the same word, right? We went through this in Genesis. So we have the conflict. The beginning of the conflict is in chapter 3, where we have the enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And we have a great escalation in chapter 10, because in chapter 10, we see Canaan, who is the seed that has a curse on possessing the land. The land is always supposed to be for the seed that is blessed, not the seed that is cursed. That's why Cain is expelled from the land, but Seth remains in the land, right? That's why Lot, he chooses to go outside the lands. He chooses Sodom and Gomorrah. But God promises the land to Abraham. Same thing with Isaac and Ishmael, with Jacob and Esau. So the seed of the woman that has the blessing from God is supposed to inherit the land. But the seed of the serpent, who has a curse, is supposed to be expelled from the land. So why in the world is Canaan dwelling in the land? That is an incredible anomaly. And it represents an escalation of the enmity between the seeds. And we have to resolve this problem, right? And God decided that the way to resolve this problem was to have Israel go and do war against the Canaanites and expel them from it. But they refused, as we saw in Numbers. So this then represents the crisis. This is a crisis. We were supposed to have the confrontation, but it didn't happen. Israel refused. So what we get instead is a restatement of the conflict. That's what Deuteronomy is all about. Deuteronomy is a restatement of the conflict. This is Israel's second generation exhorted to dispossess the Canaanites, to go in and confront the Canaanite. That's why Deuteronomy is so much about exhorting, commanding Israel, encouraging Israel to go in and take possession of the land. God is with them. They need to obey. They need to do this work that God is asking Israel to do. And the entire book of Deuteronomy is going to be about that. So that what we have, that the climax and the resolution is actually not in the Torah. It is in the book of Joshua. Therefore, the consequence is also going to be in Joshua, and the conclusion is going to be in Joshua. So we'll start with Joshua next week. But guess what? We're going to see that even this wasn't fully done. So it won't be until David, King David, that we're going to see kind of sort of Israel finishing the job, but not entirely. So we're going to have some more conflict. We're going to have um, the need to finish out this job, even throughout the rest of the Tanakh, and we're going to see Israel failing to do it. And so that's in the prophets, right? But this is then the plot structure of the whole Torah. And this is the place then that Deuteronomy, this is the role that Deuteronomy plays in this plot structure. So the macro plot of the Torah does not come to a conclusion in the Torah, but it does in the Nevi'im, the prophets. This connects the Torah and the Nevi'im organically, right? So they are not separate sections of the Bible. They are a plot narrative unity that tells one bigger story. So if the Torah was a macro plot, a macro story, well, now we're uniting the Torah and the prophets, the Nevi'im, to tell an even bigger story, right? An even more macro story. That's how the whole eventually is going to encompass the entire Bible and all of history, from the garden all the way to the New Jerusalem. That's really the whole history of creation in a story form, because it is a story. And I think we talked about that in the book of Genesis. But we'll touch again on that towards the end of our class. All right, so that is the continuation from Numbers to Deuteronomy. Now let's take a look at the literary structure of uh, Deuteronomy. This one is a fascinating one. So I told you there are 7 speeches in Deuteronomy, and here we have them. Well, I didn't get too creative, right? I just called it the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth, and the seventh speech. So this is so that we can see where they are located. Now, here's the thing. How can we tell that there's more than one, that there are 2, 3, 4, 5, 7? Well, because we have a beginning. Notice the introduction, right? We have an introduction, and then in verse 6, chapter 1, verse 6, there's a switch. So verses 1 through 5 is actually a narration. It is in third person. So Moses, he did this, and Israel did that. So it's speaking in third person. But a speech, when you give a speech, you're speaking in second person, right? You're saying you or y'all, right? If you're from Texas. So we see a switch then from third person to second person in verse 6. And guess what? It goes all the way to 443. So that's the first speech. It doesn't break. On verse 444, third person. And for a few verses, it's going to be in third person. And then it goes right back into second person again. So that's the second speech. Notice how long the second speech is. From chapter 4 to 26, all of that without break. Moses is speaking second person. It is called the main speech also. Then there is a third speech, chapters 27, 28, same deal, right? At the beginning of 27, I think there's one verse in third person, and then it switches to second person. And then at the beginning of 29, we get another couple of verses in third person. So we know the third speech ended in 28. And same thing happened here with the fourth speech, and the fifth begins with, there's a break between the fourth and the fifth because we have a small narrative there, third person. Same thing in chapter 32, same thing in 33. That's why we say, well, we actually have 7 speeches here. And then the conclusion, chapter 34, is all in third person. Somebody is narrating Moses' death. Obviously, the poor guy couldn't write about his own death, right? That would be a little weird. uh, so that's what we have in the book, these 7 speeches. Now, this is an outline of the speeches, but what about the content that's in them? Okay, so I try to give us a short description. What is each of these speeches all about? Well, we get the introduction and we get the historical speech because this is where he is going to bring these stories from, Numbers. Then we get the code speech. This is where we have a law code, meaning this is going to be a developed series of commandments from chapter 4 to 26, right? So this scholars call this a code, a law code. And this comes from similarities to the ancient Near East, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Then in 27 and 28, we talk about the covenant speech. Then we have a prophetic speech, an exhortation speech, and then the exhortation speech now takes the form of a song, so it is poetic. This is what is called the Song of Moses. And then we have a blessing speech, Moses blessing all of Israel. And then we have the conclusion, his death, right? Okay, so I have a third way to outline the whole book again. And it is according to the ancient Near East treaty. We talked, I think, in Exodus, we talked a little bit about the ancient Near East treaties. So these were, like today we have treaties between nations, right? Peace treaties. Well, it actually comes from the ancient Near East. Let's say a nation like Egypt in a nation like the Hittite up in what is today Turkey. They were the major powers right before the Exodus. And so they actually made a treaty between them, a peace treaty that they're not going to fight each other, not going to go to war against each other. So this was a treaty, a parity. It's called a parity treaty, meaning the two parties of the treaty, they're equals, right? They are two, both of them are big empires. However, part of their treaty was the kind of the land in between them. Here's Egypt in the south, here is the Hittites in the north, which is in Turkey today. So in between, what do you have? You have Israel, you have Lebanon, and you have Syria. So what they did is they kind of split between themselves these countries, the regions there. So the Hittites, they took Syria and Lebanon, and the Egyptians, they took the Canaan. And if you're thinking, well, what about the nations that were in these lands? Well, yeah, of course, they are less powerful nations. So guess what? They're going to be intimidated into having also a treaty. In this case, Canaan is going to have treaties with Egypt, and Lebanon and Syria are going to have treaties with the Hittites. And so these are not parity treaties because they're not equals, right? Egypt is much bigger than the Canaanites. So this is going to be a vassal. It's called a vassal treaty, meaning a servant. So this is a servant nation. This is a great king. That's what they will call themselves. The great king of Egypt, Pharaoh, he will make a covenant with a lot of the kings from these little nations. And so Egypt will offer protection for them, and they will swear allegiance to Egypt. And so there will be blessings, there will be curses if they disobey, if they were not faithful to Egypt. And you know what? It's amazing because the allegiance was expressed in terms that, like we will be like, wow, this sounds so familiar. They would express their allegiance in terms of love. Like we promise we will love the king, we're going to love the nation, and we're going to be friends. And that's exactly the language that we see in Deuteronomy and in the Bible. So what we have in Deuteronomy actually takes the same form of those covenants, of those treaties. They will have specific form. They will have a historical preamble. They will have stipulation, which is also a law code. They would have blessings and curses. They would have witnesses, and all of these elements are in Deuteronomy. So that Deuteronomy is written in the form of an ancient Near Eastern treaty, because it is actually a treaty between the great king, in this case, God himself, and his servant nation, Israel, that he is going to be her protector, her provider, and she is going to promise allegiance. We will love the Lord our God only. We will serve him only. But Israel, if you do not serve God alone and you go and serve the nations, the gods of the other nations, then God said, I'm going to have to bring curses on you. And there is an oath ceremony that takes place where Israel pledges allegiance. And there are witnesses that are called. God says, I call heaven and earth as witnesses that if you do not obey me and love me, I am going to bring these curses upon you. So all of Deuteronomy is actually written in the form of an ancient Near Eastern treaty. And so we have an outline written with that form in mind. So we have the historical prologue, the stipulation, which is the law covenant, the law code. We have instructions for covenant renewal. So Israel was supposed to renew the covenant when they enter the land. We have blessings and curses. We have covenant ratification. So they were supposed to renew in the future when they enter the land, but in the present, before Moses passed away, they ratified the covenant. So the same covenant that God made with Israel in Sinai, now he was making a covenant with the current generation. Kind of like what God did with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? He made a covenant with Abraham, and he could have said, "Hey, Isaac, I made a covenant with your dad. It applies to you. Are we good? Good. Okay, good." No, God actually said, "No, I'm making a covenant with you, Isaac. And then I'm making a covenant with you, Jacob." And so he wants to make this covenant with every generation, kind of like what we do on Passover, right? On Passover, we say that every generation is supposed to consider themselves as if they themselves came out of Egypt. That's a very real thing, so that we need to take responsibility. We are the ones that are alive today. This covenant that God made with our fathers is with us. It wasn't just with them, it was with me. It is with us. So they were supposed to, they did, not supposed to, that they did ratify the covenant. And then Moses gave them some exhortations. He called on witnesses, which comes with curses for disobedience. And then there is a final blessing. And then again, the conclusion when Moses passes away. Uh, so that's the literary structure of Deuteronomy. So with this in mind, then I am prepared to give you a preliminary content summary. Why do I say preliminary? Well, because I'm always learning, and I'm pretty sure this thing is going to change over the summer. I'm taking I'm taking an independent class for my degree, of course, in which I'm going to do the plus structure that I have done for the books. I'm going to actually go in and do it for every passage of the whole Torah. That's what I'm going to be doing this summer. So I'm going to be doing chapter by chapter, story by story, finding out what the plot structure is. So because this thing is, it adds up, right? It aggregates, so that you need to know better. I need to know better the plot structure of every story so that I can come up with an even more accurate plot story for the totality of the Torah, because this is going to be part of my dissertation anyway. So I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone, saving money, saving time, uh, so that I can get credit for doing a job that I actually need to do for my dissertation. So, and use the time that way. So here's my content summary for now. So what I say is that Deuteronomy is an exposition of the commandment, an exposition of the commandment. You remember when they asked Yeshua, what is the greatest commandment? That was actually a test, of course, right? But it was a test to say, well, Yeshua, do you really know Deuteronomy? That's really what it's all about. Remember his answer? You shall love the Lord your God. Where did that come from? Deuteronomy 6, it's the Shema, right? Uh, so he says, the greatest commandment is you shall love the Lord your God. But I'll give you an extra one that goes along with it. You got to love people, but because if you don't love people, you don't actually love God. So in Deuteronomy, this is called the commandment. There are many passages in Deuteronomy in which it says, these are the commandments. But if you look in the Hebrew, it's not plural. There are some that are plural, of course, when God speaks of commandments. But there are many where in the English Bibles it says the commandments, but it's actually singular, the commandment. And the commandment is to love the Lord your God. But uh, what God does is he says, this is the commandment to love the Lord your God. And here's how you walk it out. And in walking it out, in giving the details to what the commandment is, how do you love God? That's where we give the Hukim and the Mishpatim. So to love God, to live out the commandment, is to worship God according to his statutes and love people according to his mishpatim, right? Because the mishpatim is the civil or the fellowship commandments, right? The one another commandments, the love your neighbor commandments, and the hukim are the worship commandments. Here's how you're supposed to love me, right? Worship me according to my statutes, not according to the customs of the nations. So this is what I mean by the exposition of the commandment. So Deuteronomy is an exposition, it's an explanation of the commandment, which is the explanation is the Hukim and the Mishpatim. And this is the commandment of the covenant renewal. Remember, they were supposed to renew the covenant once they enter the land, where they promised to observe the Hukim and the Mishpatim, to live loving God and loving people. So this is the exposition of the commandment of the covenant renewal to be followed after conquering the land. And he has exhortations, blessings, and curses, as well as prophesied failure and promised restoration. All of this is in Deuteronomy, right? God is going to say, you know what, Israel, you're actually going to walk away from me and you're going to worship other gods, and I am going to bring these curses upon you. And when you are in those nations and you turn to me, I will restore you back to the land, back to me, and you will be blessed again. And that's in the end times. Um, it expressly uses that phrase. It's in the end times. So this is my summary of Deuteronomy. I think I need to work on this a little bit and add some things, but I think this is a pretty good representation of what's in this book. Um, and to me, it's a blessing to have a statement, one statement that has the majority of the content of this book. If there's anything that I need to probably add, will be the historical sections. How the stories are brought in at the beginning of Deuteronomy. How do they fit? And how can I fit them into this description? So I'll share with you after I work on this and see where I land. All right, so we've talked a lot about the Hukim and the Mishpatim, but I want to go a little further into this, explaining what that is. So an explanation of the Hukim and Mishpatim. These are types of commandments along with the Torot. The Torot is the word that is the plural of Torah. So Hukim is plural, Mishpatim is plural, and Torot is plural. So these are the three types of commandments in the Torah. So you may have heard in Christian theology, the Torah, the commandments are organized as moral commandments, civil commandments, and what is the word? There's a word that's escaping my mind. I should have written this, but it's kind of like the ritual commandments, right? Um, I'm sorry.
Ceremonial.
Say it louder.
Ceremonial.
Ceremonial. Yes, that's it. That's it. So it's the ceremonial, the civil, and the moral. So the moral is supposed to be the Ten Commandments. The civil is supposed to be, kind of like what you see in Exodus. Uh, Really, that has to do with nations, with a court of law and people suing other people. So in Christianity, they say, well, we can't really implement that. There may be some application for fellowship in the church, this church discipline or things like that. But that's really having to do with the court system. That's kind of done away with. The civil law is done away with. The ceremonial, of course, is done away with. The sacrifices, they're not for today at all. So, Paul offering sacrifices in in Acts 21, they haven't thought about that one. If they think about that one, they say, well, Paul was wrong, or they just really don't get into it. So the ceremonial law is canceled. The civil law pretty much canceled. The only thing that lasts is the moral law, which is the Ten Commandments, according to their explanation, except for the Shabbat, of course, because that's ceremonial. uh, but you never hear anywhere in the Word of God, in the Torah or anywhere else, that kind of organization of the commandments. There's no such thing. Because guess what? Here in Deuteronomy, you're going to mix the mishpatim and the hukim in ways that you cannot separate them. So the hukim are the worship commandments. The mishpatim are the civil. Here's how you love people. Here's how you love God. And the Torah are the commandments that are specific to the priest, how to handle the blood and the flesh of the sacrifices. So these are the real categories of the Torah, not these superimposed, man-made categories. No, these are the real organic categories that come from the Word of God itself. And so what we have then is that in Deuteronomy, we're going to have a blend of the two. And let me explain how that works. So for instance, uh, under the Mishpatim, the civil law, if a person murders someone, then they get the death penalty, right? So the court brings civil or criminal punishment for a crime, or they bring a civil compensation. Hey, I lent you my donkey, it died in your possession. Hey, you need to pay me for it. And the courts will make a decision. Yes, this person borrowed it and it died under his uh, possession of it. You gotta pay for it. Hopefully you had insurance, right? So so but in the Hukim, if a person went and worshiped other gods, then you can't bring them to court. I mean, you can't bring somebody to court for worshiping false gods. But guess what? In Deuteronomy, you can and you should. Well, when I say you, I mean Israel, right? Because it has to be under a theocracy. It has to be even when there was a kingdom, right? David, Solomon, and them, they were still governed by the Torah. So the Torah was the constitution of the nation. And so in that sense, they still had a kind of like an indirect theocracy through a monarchy. We don't have that today. We don't have the power to enforce that. And so that's not what we are all about today. But that doesn't mean that these things are canceled. They're not canceled. They're not done away with. We need to study how the Torah works so that we know how God works. So in the Torah, there's going to be a blend of the civil, which is the court system, and the worship commandments, because in the Torah, if someone, it says, if your neighbor um, comes to you and it says, let us go up and worship other gods, you need to bring it to the judges. They will investigate the matter. If it happens that it is true, this person is supposed to receive the death penalty. And so here we see a blend of the mishpatim and the hukim, of the civil court type of commandment with the worship and religious commandment. Because of that, these commandments are inseparable. So you cannot separate the ritual or what was that word you said? Ceremonial. Yeah, the ceremony. You can't separate the ceremonial from the moral and from the civil. That's not how it works. You can't break that because the word of God brings them together and they are organically a unit. And so that's, we have to understand that in order to understand the Torah. And when we read those commandments, it's not a matter of setting up court today, but as a congregation, we can, like we see in First Corinthians, right? If somebody decides to live an immoral life, well, we have to expel them from the fellowship, and that is a form of death. And even it says, that God may take away their physical life if they insist after being corrected and trying to help and all that. If they insist, then the Lord may take their physical life. Corinthians says, and some of you have gone to sleep, meaning some of you have died. So, and the issue in First Corinthians 5, with the guy taking probably his stepmother, after his father died or something like that, expressly forbidden in the Torah. So those are applications for today in which we don't have a theocracy set up in Israel in which the Torah is the law of the land. Okay, so the Hukim then, as we've said, are the commandments about pure worship, not worshiping God according to the customs of the nations, which is idolatry, but according to his customs, right? Shabbat, the feasts, the sacrifices, the temple, etc. The Mishpatim are the judgments or the ordinances. That's how it's translated usually, one of those two words. And they are all about compassionate decisions to deliver the oppressed. Compassionate decisions to deliver the oppressed, right? In our court system, we want to know who did it and what's the punishment. In the biblical court system, they want to know who was affected, who needs compensation here, and what should be that compensation. Yes, they're going to punish the person, the perpetrator, but usually it's going to have to be in a form of compensating for the oppression they brought about to this person. I think that's much more corrective to the perpetrator and more just to the victim. But that's the court system that we have. Yes, it is biblically based, right? So that's what we talk about, Judeo-Christian values. However, it does come through the Christian interpretation of the Torah. So it got mixed in. It has Bible, but it got mixed in also with the court systems that came from the nations, whether it is Roman uh, uh, law system or the English system. They're not pure Bible. That's why, it looks a little different. The main code speech of Deuteronomy, the one that goes from 4 to 26, is about commandments to Israel to love God with everything and in all walks of life, to worship God, not according to the nations, but according to God's customs, and to not oppress people, but issue judgments that are compassionate. So the Hukim and the Mishpatim, they come together in this book. If you have any questions, feel free to jump in and interrupt me. Otherwise, we're going to keep going here with the plot structure now of Deuteronomy.
Joey,
Yes.
so when you talked about the preliminary content summary,
Uh-huh.
that it was all about that God calls them and he's telling them what he wants them to do, and then he prophesies that they're going to fail, and then he says, but there's going to be promised restoration. That's like the whole theme of our history forever.
Yeah.
That before the foundation of the world, he says, you're going to be mine, I'm going to call you. And then he says, and you're going to fail. and you're going to be punished by your failure, but then I'm going to bring you back to me.
Yep.
That's the huge big thing right there.
It's the prodigal son.
Yes.
It's the
It's
repeat
a
button.
summary of the word of God. Yes. Yes, Lewis.
No, I was just saying it's like the repeat button. It's a cycle
Yeah.
because of our depravity and because we can't do anything of ourselves, and it has to be through Yeshua. It's a cycle it's a circle that goes around and around. It's like a repeat button. It's the same thing, different circumstances, different
Yep.
situations, but it's the same thing.
It's one template.
Yes. Yes.
And he did it anyway.
Yep. Yep. Knowing what we
Yes.
would do and what it will cost him, he still went ahead because he knew that the glory, see, in doing so, he manifests his glory.
Yes.
He makes himself known to these creatures he's going to create. He will be known by them, and being known by them means that they will experience him. They will
Yes.
experience his glory, his salvation, his
Amen.
love, his redemption. And that was worth going through all of the pain for him.
And it's who he is. He
Exactly.
can do nothing else.
Yep.
Incredible.
Yep.
Incredible.
Very good. All right. Let's now then talk about the plot structure of Deuteronomy itself. So this is a section we kind of repeat in every class, right? For every book. Although Deuteronomy is not primarily a historical narrative, it does have what is called a narrative frame, right? And as such, having a narrative frame means that it has plot, because plot is the universal structure of narrative, of stories. And so we talked about the plot structure: context, conflict, climax with resolution, then consequence and conclusion. So we're going to apply this. We're going to see how Deuteronomy fits into its own plot structure. We don't force this on the book. We try to discover where in the book do we have each of these points, not because it has to have it, but because since it is a story, it does have it. It does have the plot structure, because all stories have a plot structure, especially since the storyteller is the master storyteller. So even more so, it has to have a plot structure, because God tells perfect stories. You know, the content, the people in the story are not perfect. What they do is not perfect, but the storyteller is perfect. And so we have these stories that have a plot structure, and our job is to discover how he distributed all of these components. So here's my humble proposition to you, right? I'm not saying I'm infallible when I do this, but I've done quite a few of these by now. You've heard me talk about this for a few years now, and this is going to continue to be my theme. Is going to be my dissertation. So hopefully I'll get even better at working on stories and how God tells stories, how he hides these plot structure in every story of the Bible, because it helps us. You know, the reason I do this is because of the consequence. This is the surest way to arrive at what is the message of the story, whether it is a single story or a macro story. This is the surest way to arrive at what the theological message is. So that way you eliminate a lot of opinions, because it's not what it seems to you or what it seems to me or to her or to him, but it is how all of this depends on the distribution of the verbs in the Hebrew. That's why this is so precise. And that is a safety net. It's a great safety net to ensure that we have great accuracy as we interpret the word of God, that we know where this consequence is found in the macro story in this case. So we know what the main message is, and we know how to align the rest of the story so that we emphasize not what is peripheral, but we emphasize what is actually God emphasizing in the story. So what we have then here is that, and let me show you a little bit how to work through this, because I want to empower you. I don't want to, when I teach, I always teach like a cooking show. You see, I don't want to just bring the meal and, here's the meal, smell it and, taste it maybe. No, I want to show you how I put it together. I want to show you how I cut everything, how I mixed everything, how I cooked everything, and how it came to be this way. So here, showing you this, it's like, here's the meal. Yeah, but I want to talk about how I put it together so that you can take one story and say, that guy, he can't be all that much smarter than me. Maybe I can do this too. So let me walk you a little bit through how I think through this. All right. So the first thing I actually want to look for is the conflict. So I want to know from the beginning of the story, right? We usually know where it starts, where it starts, right? It starts in chapter 1, verse 1, right? Or it starts in the first verse of I know there was an ending here, and now I know I have a beginning here. So that's my beginning, right? The beginning is not rocket science. What I need to look for is, where's the conflict here? Sometimes the conflict, when you have an individual story, the conflict comes right away, right? The introduction is short and the conflict comes right away. And the conflict is just a problem in the story. So it's you can read your way through it and figure, okay, I clearly see there is a problem here. Where did it start? So I go back up to the top and I say, okay, it starts right here. Somebody did something that began the ball rolling to create the problem here. The problem is going to get worse and worse. But where did it start? That's what we call the inciting incident. So I summarize, I shortened it here, and I call it the incitement. So here I'm saying that God gave Israel commands to obey, and so that they can succeed in possessing the land. So if you say, I don't see the problem here. Well, we were talking a little bit about this on Shabbat, right? When I was teaching on Leviticus. That every time you have commandments, you have tension, you have a problem, you have a conflict, because when we issue commandment or when we receive commandments, right? Your wife tells you, don't stick your finger on the cake, don't touch my, put the icing on the cake, make sure you don't. What do we want to do? We want to taste that cake, is there a way I can get a little taste without her noticing? Can I put it back together, so that, hey, listen, every time we are restricted, we want to break off the restrictions and we want to do it. That's just our sinful nature. That's how little kids work, right? Make sure you don't touch the cookies. You might as well tell them, here are the cookies. Just have as many as you want, because that's what they're going to do. And we do the same, just adult version, right? So the incitement is the beginning of the problem. And that's what we have here. See, when we read Deuteronomy, we begin reading the first few chapters, we do see some problems, but we see the problems in that he is recounting the story. So he's going to tell, for instance, the story of Israel refusing entering the land, coming from Numbers. But he hasn't told us, he's summarizing the previous stuff. He's going to use that. And when he's done with the summary, then he starts giving commandments. That's the beginning of the conflict. Not in the stories recounting the past, but in the commandments he's beginning to issue now. So that's the beginning of my conflict. And then I want to see what happens before we get to the confrontation. So we may even see some confrontations, um, happening at a small scale, but I want to find the last confrontation, the one in which the whole thing breaks out, that leads to the resolution. So that is going to be my big climax, my big confrontation. So if I have whatever I have between the incitement, the beginning of the conflict, and whatever I have between that and the climax when they have the big confrontation, anything I have in between them, that's going to be part of my conflict. So I have different names for it. I call it the complication. Sometimes I call it the escalation. And then when it gets to the last step, I call it the crisis. There's a crisis here. So that's what I have here. I have the complication number one. Israel is to renew the covenant once in the land and experience blessing or curse. So what we have here is more commandments. That's simple as that. Complication number two is that Moses ratifies the covenant, right? As we were saying, I'm making this covenant with you today here. But he says that Israel will break this covenant, but God will restore them in the end times. So that is like another level. We could have called this an escalation, because now Moses is telling them, you are going to break this covenant. And then we have another level. So I call this the crisis. It's the level before we have the climax, before we have a confrontation, the confrontation, right? The big one. So in this case, Moses reads the covenant and tells Israel that they will be unfaithful once in the land. So the first one was, you are going to ratify the covenant, or no, we are ratifying the covenant here. But in that process, Moses is going to say, you will be unfaithful to the Lord. Once you enter the possessed land, you're going to be unfaithful to it. He doesn't talk about a restoration. He just says you're going to be unfaithful to the Lord. And then the Lord is going to punish you. And that's the confrontation. That punishment, that is the confrontation. So the Lord will exile Israel and Moses. That was very interesting. Here in chapter 32, we're coming to the end. This is the final climax here in the whole of the Torah. Well, so we have to resolve not only the story of Israel, but this has also been the story of Moses. So chapter 32 is actually going to have the confrontation, the climax, the confrontation to both. So the Lord is going to tell Israel, I'm going to exile you. And to Moses is going to tell him, no, you are not going to enter. Because both have broken, in the case of Israel, the covenant, but in the case of Moses, God told Moses, you did not sanctify me before the people. And of course, the standards were higher for Moses. And then he says, in the end time, I will restore Israel. But also God shows Moses, he says, you can't enter, but I'm going to allow you to see the land. And so this is an anticipation, so to speak. You're not going to possess it, but I'm going to let you see it, because in the end, I'm going to restore you as well, Moses. So that is the climax and the resolution. So the resolution is the restoration, right? So now we are ready for the most important part of the whole book, which is the consequence. And what do we have there? Well, we have Israel and the land are blessed. So this is the chapter of the blessing, chapter 33. And it is a blessing not only of Israel, but it's a blessing on the land, that this land is blessed just when they are about to enter and possess the land. So this is hearkening back to the garden, right? You have Adam and Eve, like Israel, are blessed. And God is going to give them a land that is good, that is blessed, that is fruitful. And so God made sure when you read chapter 33, you see the blessing on every one of the children of Israel, but also you will see a blessing on the land. This is a fruitful land. So in that regard, this is looking back at the beginning. So the end of the Torah looks back to the beginning, because there has to be correlation between the introduction and the conclusion. So the conclusion talks about the same themes that you talked about in the introduction. That's why the conclusion presents the blessed people, like Adam and Eve, and the blessed land, like Genesis 1. That's the consequence. That's the theological message of the book of Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy has been an exhortation to Israel to enter the land. And the message is, Israel, enter the land, because you are the blessed people. And to you, I am giving the blessed land. So go in and take possession of the land. Exactly what they failed to do in the book of Numbers. Then we have our conclusion, right? Moses is going to pass on, but also commission Joshua to lead Israel's conquest of Canaan. And that is going to pivot to the book of Joshua and to the Nevi'im, the prophets. So everything is wrapped up. We don't have the conclusion of the story. We have the conclusion of the Torah, but not the conclusion of the story, because the conclusion is going to be in the Nevi'im, in the prophets, in the book of Joshua. And so we'll be there next week. That's all I have for today. So I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can chat a little bit.